There's a kind of silence that doesn't feel right, not peaceful, not calm, just wrong. The kind of silence that settles in a house when something has already happened and no one has said out loud yet. On the morning of September 23rd, 2018, in Mount Holly, that silence was everywhere. Upstairs, two little girls are asleep in their beds, the kind of deep, unbothered sleep only children have, unaware that their lives are about to split into before and after. Downstairs, their mother, Stacy Robinson Honecker, isn't breathing. No struggle, no loud crash, no warning anyone could hear, just stillness. And then a phone call. A man's voice, controlled but urgent, speaks to a dispatcher. My wife, she's not breathing. He says her skin is turning blue. He says he just found her. But here's the detail that doesn't register at first. There's no chaos in the background. No panic spilling over his words. No confusion about what's happening. Just a statement. Clear, direct, final. Paramedics arrive quickly. They move with precision. Trained hands. Practiced urgency. They try. They always try. But within minutes, it's clear there's nothing to reverse. Stacy is pronounced dead at 32 years old. And almost immediately, her story begins to close itself. Because on paper, this makes sense. She had a history of heart problems, a pacemaker, years of unexplained medical episodes. To everyone standing in that room, this looks like something tragic, but natural, the kind of ending people accept when the warning signs have been there all along. No crime scene, no alarm, just a young mother whose heart finally gave out. But here's what no one in that house knew yet. Not the paramedics, not the investigators, not even her family. There was nothing natural about what happened to Stacy, because this didn't start that morning. It didn't start the night before. It didn't even start that year. If you rewind far enough, you begin to see something else entirely. A pattern, small at first, almost invisible. Symptoms that didn't make sense. Hospital visits without answers. A body slowly breaking down for reasons no one could explain. And hidden inside all of it was something no one thought to look for. Something ordinary. Something sitting in plain sight. Something that, drop by drop, can shut a human body down, while making it look like it's failing on its own. So when you look back at that quiet Sunday morning, at that still house, at that phone call, you realize something unsettling. By the time anyone thought to ask questions, whatever had been happening to Stacy had already been happening for years, and the person who might have known why was the one who made the call. Before anything went wrong, before the hospital visits, before the questions, Stacy Robinson Honecker built her life on something most people overlook. Consistency, not the kind that feels repetitive, but the kind that feels dependable, the kind that makes people feel safe around you. She grew up in Mount Holly, a place where life moves at a human pace, where people don't just pass through, they stay. They remember each other. They build history together. And Stacy chose that life. She didn't leave looking for something bigger, louder, or faster. She stayed because what she had there mattered. Her family, her church, her friendships. Those weren't background details in her life. They were her life. People who knew her don't describe her in dramatic terms. You won't hear words like larger than life or center of attention. Instead, they say things like, she noticed people, she checked in, she remembered the small things. And those details matter more than they seem, because the people who leave the deepest impact are rarely the loudest ones in the room. They're the ones who are there consistently. Stacy worked with children for years. Preschool classrooms, early learning environments, spaces where patience matters more than anything else. That kind of work tells you something about a person. You can't fake patience with children. You can't fake presence. They feel it immediately. And Stacy had that kind of presence. The steady kind. The kind that makes a child feel safe and a parent feels at ease leaving their child in your care. Outside of work, she created things. Handmade wooden signs. Simple, personal pieces. Not for attention. Not for recognition. But because she enjoyed it. Because it meant something. Her life wasn't built around big moments. It was built around small, repeated ones. And over time, those are the moments that matter most. Her connection to the church wasn't casual. It wasn't just attendance. It was involved. Participation. Belonging. In communities like Mount Holly, a church isn't just a place. It's a network. It's where people show up for each other. During celebrations. During hardship. During ordinary weeks that don't stand out. And Stacy was part of that rhythm. She didn't separate her faith from her daily life. It was woven into it. Then she became a mother. And everything else rearranged itself around that role. Not in a way that erased who she was, but in a way that sharpened it. Because everything people already knew about her, her patience, her attentiveness, her consistency, those qualities don't just disappear when someone becomes a parent. They deepen. Her daughters became her focus. Not in a loud, visible way, but in the quiet structure of daily life. Getting them ready in the morning. Making sure everything was in place. Being there at the end of the day. Bedtime routines. Small conversations. Moments that don't look important from the outside, but mean everything to a child. That's the part of life that doesn't get documented. No headlines. No milestones. Just presence. And this is where it's important to slow down. Because when people hear stories like this, they often jump ahead. They want to understand what happened. They want the explanation, the turning point. But before any of that, you have to understand who she was without the tragedy. Because Stacy's life wasn't defined by what happened to her. It was defined by how she lived, by the relationships she built, by the people who depended on her, by the consistency she brought into other people's lives. Because when something like this happens, it doesn't just take a person. It disrupts an entire structure. The routines, the stability, the everyday presence that people relied on. For her daughters, it's not just the loss of a mother. It's the loss of bedtime comfort, daily reassurance, the person who knew them best. For her parents, it's not just grief. It's the absence of someone who is still very much a part of their daily lives. And for the community, it's the realization that someone is so steady is suddenly gone. So when we talk about what happened to Stacy, we're not talking about a mystery first. We're talking about life. A life that was grounded, consistent, and deeply connected to the people around her. A life that didn't revolve around chaos, but around care. And that's what makes everything that follows so difficult to process. Because nothing about her life suggested that it would end the way it did, which raises a quiet but important question. If everything about Stacy's life felt stable, when did that stability begin to break? And more importantly, would anyone have recognized it if it did? She met Joshua Lee Honecker the way a lot of lifelong relationships begin. Young, high school, same town, same familiar faces, the same routines that shape you before you even realize it. There's something powerful about relationships that start that early. You don't just meet a person, you grow up alongside them. You see each other before careers, before pressure, before life gets complicated. And for Stacy Robinson Honecker, that connection turned into something lasting. They stayed together through transitions, through early adulthood, through the kind of changes that often pull people apart. Instead, they built something that looked stable. By the time they were married, their life followed a structure most people recognize and aspire to: a shared home, 2 careers moving forward, children. From the outside, it checked every box. Not in a flashy way, not in a perfect social media way, but in a grounded, believable way. Friends saw them at cookouts, church events, ordinary evenings that didn't stand out. And that's important, because nothing about their life demanded attention. It blended in. It felt normal. And at the center of that normalcy was trust, the kind of trust that isn't constantly questioned, the kind that doesn't need to be examined. Because it's built slowly over time, through shared history, through daily routines, through familiarity. When you've known someone that long, you stop looking for signs. You stop analyzing behavior. You assume consistency, because that's what you've always seen. And that assumption becomes invisible. Joshua's career added another layer to that trust. He worked in emergency medicine, a flight paramedic, a role that requires quick decision-making, medical knowledge, responsibility under pressure. It's the kind of profession that naturally earns respect. People trust people who save lives, and that trust doesn't stay at work. It follows them home. It shapes how others see them. It shapes how their partner sees them. Because if someone can be relied on in life or death situations, why wouldn't you trust them in everyday life? To friends and acquaintances, their relationship didn't raise questions. There were no obvious red flags, no public arguments, no visible instability, no pattern that stood out. If anything, it looked steady, predictable in the best way. And that's what makes this part of the story so important. Because when nothing looks wrong, no one goes looking for problems. This is where the tension quietly builds. Because sometimes what makes something hard to detect isn't chaos. It's the absence of it. No noise, no disruption, no clear moment where someone says, something isn't right. Instead, everything continues as expected. Days pass, routines repeat, life moves forward, and within that repetition, small changes can go unnoticed. For Stacy, this was her world, not something she questioned, not something she examined from the outside. It was her life, her marriage, her home, the environment in which she was raising her children. And like most people in that position, she wasn't looking for danger, because nothing in her experience suggested there was any. Because when we look back on cases like this, there's a tendency to search for warning signs, to ask, what did people miss? What should have stood out? But the reality is often more uncomfortable than that. Sometimes there's nothing obvious to see. Sometimes the structure itself, the routine, the trust, the normalcy, is what allows something else to exist underneath it, unnoticed. So from the outside, Stacy's life looked steady. A long-term relationship, a growing family, a routine that made sense. Nothing dramatic, nothing alarming, just two people building a life together in a place that felt familiar. And that's exactly why, when things started to change, no one recognized it for what it was. Because when something begins inside a life that already feels stable, it doesn't arrive loudly. It arrives quietly, almost invisibly. And by the time it becomes impossible to ignore, it's already been there longer than anyone realizes. After the birth of their first daughter, life should have settled into something familiar. New routines, less sleep, more responsibility. The kind of adjustment every new parent expects. But for Stacy Robinson Honecker, something didn't feel right. Not dramatically. Not in a way that immediately set off alarms. At first, it was easy to explain away. Fatigue, which makes sense. Newborns don't sleep on schedules. Dizziness. This could be stress, hormones, or exhaustion. Moments where her body just didn't feel stable. Those things happen, especially after childbirth. So at the beginning, nothing about it felt urgent. Nothing about it felt dangerous. Just off. But then it didn't go away. And more importantly, it didn't stay the same. The symptoms began to shift, intensify. Her heart rate would drop suddenly, without warning. Her blood pressure would crash to levels that weren't just uncomfortable, they were concerning. There's a difference between feeling unwell and feeling like your body is no longer responding the way it should. And Stacy was crossing into that second category. This is where the cycle begins. Doctor visits, tests, monitoring, then more tests, different specialists, different theories, and still no clear answer, no single diagnosis that ties everything together, no explanation that makes sense. And that kind of uncertainty creates its own kind of pressure, because when there's no diagnosis, there's no roadmap, no clear treatment, no defined outcome, just questions. From the outside, people often see medical cases in simple terms. You're either sick or you're getting better. But what Stacy was experiencing didn't fit into either category. It was inconsistent, unpredictable. One day, she could function. The next day, something would drop. Her heart rate, her energy, her stability. And that unpredictability changes how you live. You start anticipating the next episode. You start adjusting your life around something you can't control. Even small things become uncertain. Can I get through the day? Can I take care of my child without interruption? Will something happen when I'm alone? That's not just physical strain. That's a mental strain. Constantly. And while she was living through it, her family was watching, trying to understand what was happening. Without the information they needed, they saw the hospital visits, the exhaustion, the moments where she wasn't herself. But they didn't have answers either. And that creates a specific kind of helplessness. Because when someone you love is hurting, you want something to fight, a diagnosis, a condition, a plan. But when all you have are symptoms without explanation, there's nothing to push against, just uncertainty. Over time, the episodes became harder to ignore, more serious, less explainable. This wasn't just fatigue anymore. This was her body failing to regulate itself in critical ways. And every time it happened, it reinforced the same unsettling reality. Something was wrong, but no one could say what. And this is where the emotional weight deepens. Because there's a difference between being told what's wrong with you and not knowing. Not knowing means no timeline, no clarity, no reassurance. Just a lingering question that follows you everywhere. What is happening to me? And for Stacy, that question didn't go away. It became part of her life. Pause here, because this is the part most people move past too quickly. It's easy to summarize this period as, she was sick for a while. But that misses what it actually was. For years, Stacy wasn't just dealing with symptoms. She was trying to live through them. She was still raising her children, showing up for her family, maintaining a sense of normalcy, even when her body wasn't cooperating, even when she didn't have answers. And that kind of endurance doesn't stand out from the outside. There's no visible milestone for it, no moment where people stop and recognize it. But it's there, in consistency. It takes effort to keep going when things don't make sense. Because strength isn't always loud. Sometimes it looks like getting out of bed when you're unsure how you'll feel, taking care of others while managing your own uncertainty, continuing with routines that ground your life, even when your body doesn't feel stable. That was Stacy's reality. Not for a moment, not for a week, but over time. And eventually, what started as something subtle, something explainable, something easy to dismiss, became something undeniable. Because the body can only send so many signals before they demand attention. And Stacy's body was about to force everyone to pay attention in a way they couldn't ignore. What started as uncertainty doesn't stay that way forever. Eventually, the body forces a decision. And for Stacy Robinson Honecker, that moment came when her symptoms stopped being occasional and became dangerous. The drops in her heart rate weren't just numbers anymore. They were events, moments where something shifted suddenly, where her body didn't just feel off. It failed to respond the way it should. Her blood pressure would fall to levels that required immediate attention. Her energy would drain without warning. Her ability to stay present, alert, steady, became unpredictable. And unpredictability is what turns concern into urgency. Because when you don't know when the next episode will happen, every moment carries a question. Hospital visits became more frequent, not spaced out, not occasional, but recurring, a pattern. And with that comes a different kind of reality. You start to recognize the environment, the same hallways, the same machines, the same process of being admitted, monitored, and evaluated. Each visit carries the same hope. This time, they'll figure it out. But each time, no clear answer, just stabilization, temporary relief, and then discharge, until the next time. Then one episode goes further than the others, further than fatigue, further than instability. At one point, Stacy goes into cardiac arrest. Her heart stops functioning the way it should. This isn't uncertainty anymore. This is life-threatening. Medical teams respond immediately. Everything becomes fast, precise, urgent. This is the moment where outcomes shift, where the question isn't just what's wrong, but can we bring her back? And they do. She survives. But survival changes the conversation. After cardiac arrest, everything is viewed differently. There's no more room for watchful waiting, no more space for gradual observation. Now, intervention becomes necessary, because whatever is happening has already crossed the line into something critical. Doctors move from searching for explanations to prevent the next collapse. because the next one might not have the same outcome. Eventually, a decision is made, a pacemaker, a device implanted to regulate the heart's rhythm, to step in when the body fails to maintain stability on its own. This isn't a minor step. It's a recognition that something fundamental is no longer functioning properly. And for Stacy, this happens in her late 20s. Think about that. At an age where most people are building momentum in life, she's adjusting to a device that keeps her heart on track. A pacemaker doesn't just change your medical file. It changes how you live. There's a new awareness of your body, of your limits, of the fact that something inside you now requires assistance. It creates a kind of forced stability, a safety net, but also a reminder that something serious has happened. And for Stacy, this became part of her new normal, not something she chose, but something she adapted to. At this point, the working explanation becomes clear. A rare cardiac condition, severe, unusual, but natural. And once that assumption is accepted, everything else starts to fit inside it. Future symptoms, part of the condition. Fluctuations, expected. Complications, unfortunate, but explainable. That's how medical reasoning works. You build a framework and then interpret new information through it. Because assumptions don't just explain the present, they shape the future. They determine what doctors look for, what they don't look for, what questions get asked, and which ones never come up. Once a condition is labeled as natural, the search for alternative explanations often stops, not out of neglect, but because the case appears to be understood. And in Stacy's situation, that assumption created a sense of clarity, a sense that, while difficult, her condition was known. And within that framework, Stacy kept going. She adjusted, she adapted, she returned to her routines as much as possible, being present for her daughters, participating in family life, rebuilding a sense of normalcy. From the outside, it looked like progress, like stability had been restored. And in many ways, it had, but only within the limits of what people believed was happening. Because even as things appeared to stabilize, the underlying reality hadn't fully been explained. There was still no definitive cause, only a working theory. And that difference matters, because when something isn't fully understood, it leaves room for misinterpretation, for misconnections, for patterns that don't get recognized for what they are. By the time Stacy received her pacemaker, her life had already changed in ways she never expected. She had survived something serious. She had adapted to something permanent. And she had accepted an explanation that made sense, given what everyone knew at the time. A rare, severe cardiac condition. Unfortunate, but natural. And that belief brought a kind of closure, a sense that the worst had already happened. Those things moving forward could be managed, but what no one realized was the story not stabilizing, it was still unfolding. And the very assumption that made everything feel understandable would later become the reason it took so long to question what was really happening. After the pacemaker, everything begins to slow down, not in a dramatic, cinematic way, but in the quiet way life resets itself after a crisis. For Stacy Robinson Honecker, the urgency that once defined her days starts to ease. Fewer emergency moments, fewer hospital visits, fewer sudden drops that interrupt everything. And in that space, something familiar begins to return. From the outside, it looks like recovery. Photos show her smiling again, standing with her daughters, living in moments that feel whole, not perfect, but stable. And stability after uncertainty feels like relief. For a family, this matters because for so long, every day carried question, will something happen today? Now that question fades. Not completely, but enough. Enough to breathe again. Enough to believe things are improving. Life doesn't snap back to normal all at once. It rebuilds itself in small pieces. Stacy returns to what she knows, creating things with her hands, spending time with her children, re-engaging with the rhythm of everyday life. The routines that once felt automatic now feel intentional. Because when something disrupts your life long enough, Returning to normal doesn't feel ordinary anymore. It feels earned. Her role as a mother remains at the center. But now there's a shift, a quiet awareness of what it means to be able to show up. School mornings feel different when you've had moments where you couldn't stand steady. Bedtime routines feel different when you've experienced the possibility of not being there. And so, the small things carry more weight, more presence, more intention. She's not just going through the motions, she's reclaiming them. To friends, family, the community, this looks like a turning point. The worst is behind her. The medical crisis has been managed. The pacemaker is working. And life is moving forward again. There's comfort in that belief, because it gives the story a shape people understand. Something went wrong. It was addressed. And now things are better. That's how people expect these stories to go. And once that belief settles in, it changes everything. It changes how people interpret what they see. If she looks tired, it's recovery. If she feels off, it's adjustment. If something seems unusual, it's part of the condition. Because now, everything fits into a framework that feels complete. There's no reason to question it, no reason to look deeper. But here's where the tension begins to build, subtly, because appearing stable is not the same as being fully understood. The pacemaker addresses symptoms. It manages the heart's rhythm, but it doesn't explain why those symptoms existed in the first place. And that difference sits quietly in the background, unnoticed, unexamined. For Stacy, life continues. She participates again, in her home, in her family, in the moments that define her identity. She's present. She's engaged. She's living in a way that, from the outside, suggests resilience. And in many ways, it is. Because return to life after that kind of disruption takes effort. It takes adjustment. It takes strength that doesn't always get acknowledged. But there's something else here, something quieter. Because when you've lived through uncertainty like that, you don't forget it, even when things improve, even when life stabilizes. There's a part of you that remembers what it felt like when things didn't make sense. And that awareness doesn't disappear. It just becomes part of how you move forward. This is the moment where everything feels resolved, where the story seems to settle, where the audience, like the people around her, believes the crisis has passed. And that belief is important because it creates contrast. It builds a sense of closure before anything has actually been explained. From the outside, it looks like Stacy made it through the hardest part. Her life is stabilizing. Her family is moving forward. Her routines are returning. Everything points to recovery. Everything suggests that whatever happened has been managed. But sometimes, the most dangerous phase of a story isn't when everything is falling apart. It's when everything appears to be fine. Because that's when questions stop. That's when attention fades. That's when whatever doesn't fit, the explanation, goes unnoticed. And in Stacy's case, that moment of apparent normalcy wasn't the end of the story. It was a point where it became hardest to see that anything was still wrong. September 23rd, 2018, a Sunday. In Mount Holly, Sundays have a rhythm. They start slow. They carry a sense of routine, quiet mornings, familiar plans, the expectation that the day will unfold the way it usually does. Inside the Honecker home, nothing about that morning stands out. No signs of disruption. No indication that anything is about to change. Just another day beginning. And then, something does. There's no long build-up. No drawn-out warning. At some point that morning, Stacy Robinson Honecker becomes unresponsive. No movement. No response. No indication that she can be reached. What we know about moments like this is that they feel disjointed. Time doesn't move normally. It compresses. Decisions happen quickly, sometimes without full clarity. A call is made. Emergency services are contacted. And within minutes, paramedics are on their way. When they arrive, they move with urgency. This is what they're trained for. Assessment, intervention, stabilization. They check for responsiveness. They monitor vital signs. They begin resuscitation efforts. There's a process to it, structured, practiced. But there's also a point in cases like this where the response shifts, where the effort continues, but the outcome becomes less certain. And then, clear, They can't bring her back. In the aftermath of sudden death, one question comes first. What happened? And in Stacy's case, there appears to be an answer already in place. Her medical history, the years of documented heart problems, the hospitalizations, the cardiac arrest she survived, the pacemaker, all of it creates a framework that feels complete, a narrative that makes sense. So when she is pronounced dead at 32, the conclusion comes quickly. A medical event, a cardiac-related death, tragic but explainable. And this is something most people don't see. Not every death triggers an investigation. When there is a known medical history, no visible signs of external harm, no immediate contradiction in the scene, the system follows the most logical path, which, in this case, is natural causes. There's no crime scene tape, no forensic urgency, no immediate reason to question what's already been established, because everything appears to align. That's what makes this moment so important. Not what happens, but what doesn't happen. No one pauses and says, this doesn't fit. No one immediately pushes for deeper analysis. No alarm is raised, because nothing about the situation on the surface demands it, and that absence shapes everything that follows. For her family, this is the explanation they're given, and it fits because they've lived through the years leading up to it. They've seen the symptoms. They've witnessed the hospital visits. They know how serious her condition appeared. So in those first moments of grief, there's also a form of acceptance, not because it's easy, but because it makes sense, at least at the time. In a matter of hours, Stacy's story is condensed into a single line. A young mother with a history of heart problems has died of a medical condition. It's clean, it's simple, it's final, and once a story is framed that way, it rarely gets revisited. Arrangements begin. Decisions are made quickly. The process moves forward the way it does after any death. And with each step, the sense of finality deepens. Because without question, there's nothing to hold the story open, nothing to slow it down, nothing to suggest that anything else needs to be examined. This is the closest a story comes to ending. No investigation, no suspicion, no unresolved thread. Just a conclusion that fits what everyone believes to be true. And that's what makes it so important. Because if everything had stayed within that framework, there would be no case, no deeper inquiry, no re-examination of the past, just a life remembered and a cause accepted for a brief moment. Everything about Stacy's death appears settled. A medical history, a clear explanation, a conclusion that no one feels the need to challenge. And that's where the story almost ends. Quietly, completely, without question. But what no one realizes yet is this conclusion built on an assumption, and that assumption is about to be tested. Because sometimes the most critical part of a case isn't what's visible in the moment. It's what gets accepted without being questioned. At first, everything about Stacy Robinson Honeker's death follows a familiar pattern. A sudden medical collapse, a known history of heart problems, a conclusion that feels medically consistent with what came before. In a case like this, that's usually where things end. But grief doesn't always move in a straight line. Sometimes it circles back. And for Stacy's family, that's exactly what begins to happen. In the days after her death, the official explanation remains the same. A medical event, a natural cause, a tragic but explainable outcome. But quietly, almost imperceptibly, small decisions begin to stand out, not as proof, not as evidence, but as questions. The first is simple. No autopsy is performed. On its own, that detail means very little. In many cases involving known medical conditions, autopsies are not automatically required. But to a grieving family trying to understand what happened, it creates space for uncertainty. Because an autopsy is not just a procedure. It's clear, and without it, the cause of death is accepted rather than fully examined. For a family already trying to process shock, that absence can linger. Quietly, uncomfortably. Then comes another detail. The timeline of what happens next. Arrangements move quickly. The body is cremated within a short period after death. Again, individually, this is not unusual. Families make decisions based on grief, culture, finances, and emotional readiness. But when combined with the absence of further examination, it creates a pattern, a sequence that moves from death, minimal examination, final disposition, without much interruption in between. And that begins to raise questions in hindsight, not accusations, just unease. Then there's a financial aspect. An insurance claim is filed soon after. This, too, is not inherently suspicious. Life insurance exists for exactly this purpose. But timing matters in perception, and perception in the early stages of grief is fragile. When multiple rapid steps occur close together, administrative, medical, financial, the mind starts connecting them, even when there is no clear link. And that is where discomfort begins to form. Importantly, none of these details stands as proof of wrongdoing. There is no direct contradiction, no single action that clearly indicates something criminal, just a sequence of events that, when viewed together in hindsight, feels compressed, too efficient, too aligned, too final. And that feeling is not evidence, but it is enough to make people pause. The real turning point does not come from paperwork or procedure. It comes from memory, from conversation, from inconsistencies. Because when people begin to talk about that morning, the details don't align cleanly. Different explanations begin to surface. What happened before Stacy was found unresponsive? That question should have a simple answer. But instead, there are multiple versions, small differences at first, where someone was in the house, what they were doing, when they last saw her responsive. But over time, those differences widen. And when multiple accounts of the same moment begin to diverge, attention shifts, not toward conclusion, but toward examination. In investigations, inconsistency is not guilt. It is simply a signal that memory, stress, and timing are not aligning in a clear narrative. But it also does something else. It reopens a case that was beginning to close. Because once a story stops being singular, it stops being settled. For Stacy's family, this is where grief begins to shift into something else. Not certainty, not an accusation, but persistence. A need to understand what does not yet make sense. They begin asking questions that previously felt unnecessary. What exactly happened that morning? Why did the accounts not match? What details were not recorded or examined? And once those questions are asked, they don't go away. Up to this point, the narrative had been stable. Medical history, sudden collapse, natural explanation. But now, stability begins to crack. Not dramatically, not all at once, but gradually, through detail, repetition, and reconsideration. And that shift is important, because most cases do not reopen because of one major revelation. They reopen because small details stop fitting neatly together. What makes this phase critical is not just what is being noticed, but when it is being noticed, because by this stage, the immediate urgency is gone. The official explanation is in place. The case is no longer actively questioned by systems designed to respond quickly. So any reconsideration now comes from outside that structure, from my family, from reflection, from people unwilling to let the details remain unexamined. And so the story enters a new phase, one where the facts haven't changed, but the interpretation of those facts has. A phase where certainty begins to loosen, where small inconsistencies become meaningful, where questions begin to outgrow answers that once felt sufficient. None of this proves anything on its own, but together it creates something powerful, a sense that the story may not be as settled as it first appeared. And once that door opens, it does not close easily again. There are moments in an investigation where everything shifts, not because of new emotion, not because of speculation, but because of a single piece of evidence that changes what is possible. For the case of Stacy Robinson Honecker, that moment does not come from witness testimony. It does not come from suspicion. It comes from something far more clinical, far more precise, a preserved blood sample. Stacy was an organ donor. At the time of her death in Mount Holly, that status triggered a routine medical protocol, standard procedures designed not for investigation, but for donation processing. Part of that process included something most families never think about. A small blood sample is taken and stored. not for long-term investigation, not for forensic review, but for medical screening. And in most cases, that sample is discarded or becomes irrelevant after processing is complete. In this case, it wasn't. It remained preserved, untouched, waiting. When a body is cremated, the physical evidence is gone. No tissue, no organs, no opportunity for posthumous re-examination. In many sudden deaths, that closes the door on deeper forensic review. But this case had something unusual, a biological record that survived the process, a snapshot of chemistry at the moment of death. And when investigators realized it existed, the entire trajectory of the case changed. Once the sample is secured, it undergoes toxicological analysis. This is not a general screening. It is a targeted examination, looking for substances that could explain sudden physiological collapse. What they are searching for is simple in concept. Was there anything in her system that shouldn't have been there? And if so, could it explain what happened? When the results come back, they introduce something unexpected. A compound is detected, not part of her known medical history, not part of her prescribed treatment, not something that aligns with the explanation that had been accepted up to this point. It is identified as a substance commonly found in certain over-the-counter products, everyday items, accessible products, the kind found in ordinary households. But chemistry does not behave differently because something is familiar. What matters is not where a substance is found, but how it behaves inside the human body. In controlled, external use, compounds like this are considered safe. They are designed for a localized effect. But when introduced into the body differently than intended, particularly through ingestion, the physiological response changes. The effects can include significant drops in blood pressure, slowed heart rate, central nervous system depression, severe lethargy or collapse-like symptoms, symptoms that, importantly, can resemble natural medical failure, especially in someone with a pre-existing cardiac history. This is where interpretation becomes critical, because forensic toxicology does not ask, is this dangerous in general? It asks, could this explain the observed condition? And in Stacy's case, investigators are now faced with a new possibility, one that had not been part of the original explanation, that her final medical collapse may not have been solely the result of an existing condition, but potentially influenced by an external substance. Up until this point, the working conclusion had been stable. A known cardiac history, a sudden medical event, a natural death consistent with prior conditions. But the toxicology findings disrupt that stability, not by proving intent, not by identifying a perpetrator, but by introducing a contradiction, because now there are two competing interpretations, a purely medical explanation, a chemical factor that does not belong in that narrative, and once a second explanation exists, the first one is no longer sufficient on its own. This is a true turning point, not the discovery of guilt, not the identification of motive, but the collapse of certainty. Investigators are now required to reconsider the timeline of symptoms, the progression of her medical history, the cause of her earlier episodes, because toxicology doesn't just explain death, it reframes life. The most unsettling part of this development is not the substance itself. It is what it implies about everything that came before. Because if a chemical agent is present at the time of death, then earlier unexplained symptoms may need reinterpretation. Episodes once labeled as cardiac instability, rare medical fluctuation, unexplained collapse, now sit under a different kind of question mark, not as conclusions, but as symptoms that may have had an additional cause. From an investigative standpoint, everything changes in structure. Before, medical history explains death, no need for criminal inquiry. After, medical history alone may be insufficient. External factors must be considered. That shift is subtle in language, but massive in implication, because it transforms the case from what happened naturally to what else could have contributed. And that second question opens the door to an entirely different direction of investigation. At this point, nothing has been proven beyond doubt. No conclusions are finalized. No definitive narrative replaces the old one. But something irreversible has occurred. The case is no longer closed in interpretation. The assumption of natural cause has been disrupted, and once that disruption exists, the investigation cannot return to how it began, because now every earlier detail, every symptom, every hospitalization, every unexplained episode has to be viewed again, not as isolated events, but as pieces of a timeline that may not have been understood at all. This is a part of the case that doesn't feel like an investigation anymore. It feels like rewriting memory, because once the toxicology findings enter the picture, everything that came before them stops being history in the normal sense. It becomes evidence waiting to be reinterpreted. For Stacey Robinson Honecker, this shift is where her story stops being viewed as a sequence of medical events and starts being examined as something far more unsettling. Investigators don't begin with accusations. They begin with a question, a simple one, almost uncomfortable in its simplicity. What if the symptoms were never random? What if they weren't isolated medical episodes at all? What if they were connected, not by chance, but by pattern? This is what reframing does. It forces a second reading of everything that once felt explained. The years of unexplained fatigue, sudden drops in heart rate, repeated hospital admissions, episodes that never fully resolved. All of it, once categorized as mysterious cardiac instability, is now placed under a different kind of scrutiny, because now investigators are not asking, what did the doctors see at the time? They are asking, what might have been happening underneath what they saw? And this is where the case becomes psychologically heavier, because there is a difference between a medical condition that progresses unpredictably and a pattern that appears unpredictable but may not be. So the question becomes, what if those episodes were not spontaneous? What if they were not the natural progression of a rare condition? What if something external was influencing them, quietly, gradually over time, not in a way that causes immediate collapse, but in a way that mimics illness, that blends into normal diagnostic uncertainty, that disappears inside medical complexity, because it doesn't rely on a single moment. It doesn't point to one event. It pulls everything into reconsideration. Suddenly, each hospital visit is no longer isolated. Each symptom is no longer separate. Each unknown cause becomes part of a possible pattern. And patterns change everything in investigative work, because patterns suggest direction, not randomness. Before this stage, Stacey's medical history had a framework, a rare cardiac issue, a complicated but natural condition, a series of unfortunate but explainable episodes. That framework gave meaning to uncertainty. It made chaos feel structured. But now that structure is being questioned, and once structure is questioned, meaning begins to shift. Investigators begin to reinterpret the past differently, not emotionally, but structurally. They begin asking, could the timing of symptoms matter? Could the repetition indicate interference rather than progression? Could flare-ups have had an external trigger rather than a biological one? These are not conclusions. They are analytical reframes. But even as questions, they are disruptive, because they change what investigators are looking at. There is something deeply unsettling about reviewing a life in reverse, because every past explanation suddenly feels fragile. Every diagnosis that once felt definitive now carries an unspoken question mark. And in Stacey's case, that discomfort intensifies because the symptoms were real, the suffering was real, the medical emergencies were real. Nothing about her experience is being denied. What is changing is interpretation of why it happened. As investigators go back through records, they are no longer looking for confirmation of illness. They're looking for consistency in timing, repetition in presentation, and alignment in events that previously seemed unrelated. And that shift, away from isolated events and toward connected behavior, is what transforms a case from medical history into a potential investigation. Because illness does not typically behave like coordination, but interference, if it exists, often does. This is also where the emotional weight returns, because reframing is not just technical, it is deeply personal. For Stacey's family, it means revisiting years of memories, moments of fear that once felt random, hospital visits that once felt explained, symptoms they learned to accept, and now having to hold a second possibility alongside them, not replacing the first, but it exists next to it. And that duality is difficult to carry, because it means nothing in the past is fully settled anymore. One of the most significant changes in this phase is linguistics. Words like unknown cause, mysterious condition, rare complication begin to lose their comfort, because unexplained is no longer neutral. It becomes a space where something else might have been missed, not necessarily proven, but no longer dismissible. By the end of this phase, investigators are no longer simply reviewing medical history. They are reconstructing it, piece by piece, event by event, not to change what happened, but to understand whether everything that happened was interpreted correctly at the time. And that is the most unsettling realization of all. Nothing about Stacy's suffering is being questioned, only the assumption that it was understood. And once that assumption breaks, the past stops being fixed. It becomes something that has to be re-examined from the beginning. This is the moment the story stops moving forward, not because there are no more facts to uncover, but because everything suddenly feels heavier than facts. Because at this point, we are no longer only looking at how Stacy Robinson Honecker died. We are looking at how she lived through the years leading up to it. And that changes the entire emotional structure of what we think we understand. It's easy in cases like this to focus on the final moment, the collapse, the emergency call, the medical response, the conclusion, but that framing compresses a life into a single point. And Stacy's story refuses to stay that small, because what stands out when you slow everything down is not just the end, it's the long middle, the years in between, the uncertainty she lived with without knowing what the outcome would be. Imagine living in a body that doesn't behave predictably, not once, not briefly, but repeatedly. Moments where you feel normal, then suddenly don't. Times when everything is stable, then everything shifts again. And each time, there is no clear explanation that fully holds everything together. That kind of experience does something subtle over time. It changes how you move through the world. It changes how you trust your own body. It changes what normal even means. Medical records can document symptoms. They can track episodes. They can record interventions. But they don't fully capture the emotional experience of not understanding what is happening to you. They don't show the quiet anxiety before symptoms return, the mental exhaustion of repeated uncertainty, the effort of trying to function while not feeling fully stable. And yet, for Stacy, that invisible layer is where much of her life was lived, not in dramatic moments, but in the everyday effort to keep going anyway. It's important to pause here, because when cases are reconstructed, there's a tendency to turn a person into a sequence of events, symptoms, treatments, outcomes. But Stacy was not a sequence. She was a mother, a daughter, a person building a life in real time while trying to make sense of what her body was doing to her. She still showed up for her children. She still participated in her family life. She still carried responsibilities, even when things felt uncertain. That matters, because endurance is not passive. It is active. It is daily. It is often unseen. One of the most difficult parts of her story is not just the severity of what happened, but the ambiguity that surrounded it for so long. Not knowing is its own kind of burden, because when there is no clear answer, every new symptom feels unpredictable. Every improvement feels temporary. Every setback feels unexplainable. That creates a life that is constantly waiting for clarity that never fully arrives. And living like that changes a person. Quietly, over time, this is where perspective shifts. Because if you only look at the outcome, the story feels contained. But if you step back and look at the lived experience, something else becomes clear. This was not a short event. It was a long stretch of uncertainty that shaped everyday life. And that realization reframes everything that came before it. Not isolated incidents, but as part of a human experience that was ongoing, unresolved, and deeply felt. Even now, what lingers is not just a question of cause. It is the recognition of time. Years where things did not make sense. Years where answers were incomplete. Years where life continued anyway. And that combination, Continuation inside uncertainty is what makes the story difficult to fully absorb, because it forces us to hold two truths at once. She was living her life, and something was deeply wrong within it. Neither cancels the other. Both exist together. So when we step back from the timeline, from the medical findings, from the investigative shifts, what remains is simpler and heavier. A woman trying to live normally inside something that was anything but normal. And that changes how we understand her story. Because it was never just about the final day. It was about everything that led up to it. And everything she carried through it, without ever having the full picture why. Once the toxicology findings shifted the foundation of the case, the investigation around Stacey Robinson Honecker stopped being retrospective interpretation and became active construction. No longer was the question simply what happened. Now it was, how could this have happened without being detected? And more importantly, who had both the opportunity and the knowledge to make it possible? Investigators begin where all complex cases eventually converge, not with assumptions, but with structure. They reconstruct the life surrounding Stacey's final years, looking for patterns that align across multiple categories: behavior, access, timing, knowledge, opportunity. Each category on its own means little, but together they form a framework. And within that framework, investigators start testing consistency. The first layer is behavior, not dramatic actions, not isolated incidents, but patterns over time. Investigators review how interactions evolved in the household, how responses to medical episodes were recorded, how explanations for symptoms shifted across different points in time. They are not looking for emotion. They are looking for structure, because behavior, when repeated, can either support coincidence or suggest something more deliberate. The second layer is financial activity, not as a motive in isolation, but as a contextual anchor. Life insurance policies, timing of claims, financial changes following major medical events. On their own, these are standard elements of post-death administration. But in investigative work, timing matters, sequence matters, and investigators examine whether financial actions align naturally with grief or cluster too closely around key medical milestones. This does not establish guilt, but it establishes relevance. The third layer introduces one of the most critical elements: knowledge, because understanding how symptoms manifest is not the same as knowing how to replicate them. Investigators focus on whether there was familiarity with medication effects, understanding of cardiovascular response, awareness of how certain compounds influence heart rate and blood pressure. This matters because the alleged mechanism under review does not require complex equipment. It requires understanding. And understanding, when paired with access, becomes significant. Opportunity is reconstructed through timelines, where individuals were, what they reported doing, how those accounts align with known events. Investigators compare stated movements during critical windows, documented presence or absence, and variations in recollection across different accounts. Consistency becomes a key investigative metric, because in many cases, it is not one contradiction that matters. It is a repeated inconsistency across multiple points of reference. At this stage, investigators are not yet making final determinations, but they are doing something more important. They are testing whether the collected information fits a single coherent explanation. And in this case, certain elements begin to converge. Medical anomalies that now require recontextualization, access to substances relevant to toxicology findings, behavioral and financial timelines that warrant closer review, inconsistent accounts surrounding critical moments. None of these individually determines the outcome, but together they narrow interpretive space. Eventually, the threshold is crossed where authorities determine that the evidence meets the standard for formal charges. This is not a conclusion of guilt. It is a legal determination of sufficiency, that there is enough to present the case in court. Charges are filed, an arrest follows, and the case enters the judicial system. At this point, it is critical to understand what has and has not happened. An arrest does not equal conviction. Charges do not equal proof. An indictment is not a verdict. What has occurred is procedural escalation. a formal acknowledgement that the state believes the evidence warrants trial, not certainty, not closure, but examination under law. This is where cases often become misunderstood in public perception, because once charges are filed, narratives tend to harden. But inside the legal system, the process is still open-ended. Evidence will be tested, arguments will be challenged, interpretations will compete. And only after that process can conclusions be drawn. For Stacy's family, this moment represents something complex. It is not a resolution, but it is a movement. After years of uncertainty, medical ambiguity, and investigative review, the case has now entered a formal stage where their concerns are being examined within a courtroom framework. That alone is significant, but it does not resolve the emotional weight of what they have lived through. With charges filed, the structure of the case changes again. Investigators step back. Attorneys step forward. Evidence becomes testimony. Timelines become exhibits. Medical findings become arguments. Everything that was once investigatory becomes adversarial, and what was once uncertain becomes contested. By the end of this phase, the story no longer sits in the space of suspicion or interpretation. It now sits in the space of law, not resolved, not concluded, but formally structured for examination. And as the case moves toward court, one truth becomes clear. Everything that has been uncovered so far is no longer just about understanding what happened. It is about proving it. And that process has only just begun. While the legal system begins to structure the case around charges and evidence, the world around it doesn't slow down. For the family of Stacey Robinson Honecker, time moves differently. The courtroom may be the center of the case now, but their reality is something else entirely. Not closure, not certainty, but endurance. In most narratives, grief is imagined as stillness, withdrawal, silence. But for Stacy's parents, that is not what happens. Instead, grief becomes movement, tasks, decisions, phone calls, meetings, legal coordination. Because when a death stops feeling fully explained, mourning shifts shape. It becomes something active, something that requires direction, something that refuses to settle. Stacy's parents are no longer only processing loss. They are now positioned in a different role. Advocates. That shift is not chosen lightly. It happens because passive grief is no longer enough to hold what they are experiencing. They are no longer only asking, "Why did she die?" They are also asking, "What happened to the life she lived before that moment?" And those questions do not resolve easily. They accumulate. Unlike grief that comes with a clear explanation, this kind carries something heavier, unfinished interpretation. There is no single moment of closure they can anchor to. Instead, there are layers, medical records that raise questions, timelines that do not fully align, investigative developments that shift understanding over time. Each new detail does not necessarily bring peace. It brings more complexity. And complexity in grief is exhausting, beyond the legal process itself. There's another layer of responsibility. Stacy's children. In many cases, the aftermath of tragedy does not end with the loss itself. It extends into custody, protection, and long-term care. For her parents, this becomes part of their daily reality. They are not only thinking about what happened, they are thinking about what continues, about stability, about safety, about continuity for two young lives now shaped by absence and legal uncertainty. That responsibility changes everything, because it is no longer just about the past. It is about what comes next. What most people don't see in cases like this is how quickly family members become part of the infrastructure of a case. Not officially, but functionally. They communicate with attorneys, respond to legal developments, manage emotional and logistical fallout, preserve memories and documentation, remain present through procedural delays that stretch for years. It is not visible in headlines, but it is constant. Persistent sounds strong, but it is not easy. It requires repeating painful information, revisiting moments that feel unresolved, engaging with systems that move slowly and formally while emotions remain immediate. And all of this happens while still grieving. There is no separation between the roles. They overlap continuously. Public attention tends to focus on investigation milestones, toxicology findings, arrests, charges, court dates. But what happens in between those milestones is where the real emotional weight sits. For families like Stacy's, the legal process is not a linear process. It is an interruption layered over grief, and it stretches far beyond what most people ever see. As the case develops, something subtle happens. Stacy is no longer only remembered as a victim in a case file. She becomes something larger within her family's ongoing effort, a reason, a point of focus, a presence that continues to shape decisions long after her death, not in abstraction, but in daily reality. Advocacy in this context is not public performance. It is often quiet. It is reading legal documents, attending proceedings, coordinating with professionals, holding conversations that reopen grief repeatedly. It is not linear progress. It is sustained engagement with uncertainty, and it continues long after media attention fades. Even as the case moves forward, the emotional center does not shift, because legal progress does not equal emotional resolution. There is still unanswered interpretation of past events, ongoing concern about outcomes, the weight of waiting for systems to conclude what families have already been forced to live through. And waiting is not passive. It is an active tension over time. As the legal process continues toward court proceedings, the public narrative often focuses on evidence and argument. But for Stacy's family, the narrative is something else entirely. It is not built around resolution. It is built around persistence, a commitment to remain present in a process that moves slowly, formally, and often painfully. Because long after the investigation advances, their role does not end. It continues in the background of the legal system, in the foreground of their lives, and in everything they still hope will eventually be fully understood. As the case currently stands, there is no ending, not in the legal sense, not in the investigative sense, and certainly not in the emotional sense for the family of Stacy Robinson Honecker. What exists instead is something more suspended, a case that has moved through suspicion, investigation, and formal charges, but has not reached its final determination. In court, the framework is clear but incomplete. The accused has pleaded not guilty. That plea matters, because in the legal system, it preserves a fundamental principle. That accusation is not a conclusion. It ensures that every claim must be tested. Every piece of evidence must be examined. Every interpretation must be challenged. And so the case continues forward, not as a resolution, but as a process. Legal proceedings remain active. This means the case is still in motion through the structured stages of the justice system. Pre-trial motions, evidentiary review, procedural hearings, preparation for trial arguments. Each step exists not to declare truth, but to test it, slowly, methodically, within the rules of law. And until that process is complete, nothing is final. A not guilty plea is often misunderstood outside the courtroom. It is not a statement of innocence. It is a legal position requiring the state to prove its case beyond a reasonable doubt. That distinction is critical, because it means the burden of proof has not yet been met in court. The allegations exist, the evidence exists, but they have not yet been tested in full adversarial examination. At this stage, the case exists in a narrow but important space. Evidence has been gathered, interpretations have been formed, charges have been filed, but none of it has been finalized through a trial verdict. This is the space where law and uncertainty overlap, where narratives are still competing, where interpretation is still active, and where the outcome remains unknown. For the public, cases often feel like they move in clear stages: investigation, arrest, resolution. But in reality, the longest phase is often the one in between: the waiting, the legal preparation, the procedural buildup, the years where nothing is decided, but everything is being examined. And this is where the present moment sits, not at the beginning, not at the end, but in the middle of a process still unfolding. Even with charges and investigative findings, key elements remain subject to court determination: how evidence will be interpreted under legal standards, how competing explanations will be weighed, what conclusions a jury or judge will ultimately reach. Nothing in the case has been fully resolved in a legal sense. That means the story still has multiple possible outcomes. all still open. All are still dependent on trial proceedings. While the legal system operates through procedure, evidence, and argument, the human reality continues outside of it. Families still wait. Lives remain shaped by uncertainty. And the absence of final verdict means the emotional chapter is still open-ended. There is no definitive closure point yet, only continuation. Cases remain present in public attention, not because they are resolved, but because they are unresolved, because unanswered questions carry persistence, because evidence without conclusion creates tension, and because the gap between what is known and what is proven remains active. That gap is where attention stays. From here, the path forward is procedural. The case moves toward trial. Arguments will be presented. Evidence will be tested under scrutiny. Witnesses may be called. Competing interpretations will be challenged in a formal setting designed specifically to resolve uncertainty. But until that process is complete, nothing changes in terms of the end outcome. So as it stands today, the case of Stacey Robinson Honecker remains open in the only way that matters in court. No verdict, no final determination, no legal conclusion, only evidence waiting to be weighed, arguments waiting to be tested, and a story that, even after years of investigation and legal action, is still not finished, because in the justice system, truth is not assumed, it is decided, and that decision has yet to come. It's easy, almost instinctive, to focus on the mechanics of a case like this: the toxicology, the timeline reconstruction, the investigative shifts, the legal procedures that followed. Those elements are concrete. They are measurable. They give structure to something that, at its core, resists simple explanation. But when you strip all of that away, the case of Stacey Robinson Honecker is not primarily about science or investigation. It is about a life that unfolded inside uncertainty, and the people who refused to let that uncertainty remain unexamined. Before it became a case file, Stacey's story was lived in real time, not as a sequence of diagnoses or conclusions, but as days, routines, and interruptions that didn't always make sense at the time. Years where her body was not fully predictable. Moments where answers never fully arrived. Periods where explanations existed, but never felt complete. And through all of it, she kept living, not in abstraction, but in the everyday reality of motherhood, responsibility, and persistence. That part of the story is often the easiest to overlook, because it doesn't appear in court records, but it is where the human weight actually sits. In many cases, uncertainty eventually settles into acceptance. A cause is assigned, a conclusion is reached, a story becomes fixed. But Stacey's family did not allow the early explanation to become the final one, not because they rejected everything outright, but because they felt the explanation did not fully hold together under closer reflection. That instinct, that something didn't fully align, became the reason the case did not remain closed. And in that refusal to settle too quickly, the trajectory of everything that followed changed. Because persistence, in investigative terms, is not emotional, it is structural. It keeps questions active long after systems are ready to move on. And then there is the detail that quietly sits at the center of it all. Not dramatic, not emotional, but procedural. A preserved biological sample. Taken because she was an organ donor. Stored because the protocol required it. Not created for investigation, but capable of becoming part of one. That sample did something rare in cases like this. It survived the endpoint. It remained available when everything else had already been finalized. And when it was finally analyzed, it changed what investigators were able to ask, not by answering everything, but by expanding the range of what could be considered. This is a turning point that is often misunderstood. The importance of that preserved sample is not that it resolved the case. It is that it redefined what questions were valid. It shifted the case from what fits the existing explanation to what else could explain what we now know exists. That shift is subtle, but in investigative work, it is foundational, because once the question changes, the entire structure of interpretation changes with it. One of the most important lessons from this case is that explanation and understanding are not the same thing. An explanation can be simple, consistent, and widely accepted, but understanding requires completeness. It requires that all relevant information be accounted for. And when new information appears, even late, it forces everything else to be reconsidered in relation to it. That is what happened here. Not a replacement for truth, but an expansion of context. Amid all of the investigation, one thing does not change: the human reality of the person at the center of it, a mother, a daughter, a person whose life contained complexity long before it ever became a case. That reality is not altered by toxicology results or legal arguments. It remains constant, and it is easy to lose sight of that when cases become technical. But this story resists that reduction, because at every stage, it returns to the same core fact. A real life was lived through real uncertainty. Cases like this linger not because every detail is resolved, but because they are not, because they sit in the space between what was believed at the time, what was later discovered, and what has not yet been fully determined. That space is uncomfortable, but it is also honest. It reflects how most complex human events actually unfold, messy, partial, and slowly understood over time. If you remove everything else, the legal framing, the investigative progression, the technical findings, what remains is simple: a life that was not fully understood while it was unfolding, a family that continued asking questions when answers felt incomplete, and a single preserved piece of evidence that allowed those questions to continue further than anyone expected, not to end the story, but to deepen it. And so this case is not just about what was discovered. It is about what became possible to reconsider. Because sometimes the most important role of evidence is not to close a story. It is to reopen it, to widen it, to make sure that what happened is not reduced too quickly into something smaller than it really was. And in the end, that is what this case really is. Not just an investigation, not just a legal process, but a reminder that understanding a life is never immediate. And sometimes it begins only when someone finally asks a better question. The trial has not yet begun, not in its full form, not in a space where evidence is tested under pressure, where competing interpretations collide, where certainty is demanded from fragments of fact. Everything that has led here, every investigation, every reinterpretation, every procedural step, now points forward to that moment, because when the trial finally happens, it will not just review what is known, it will decide what story survives. For the case of Stacey Robinson Huneker, that is where everything now rests, not in speculation, not in assumption, but in a formal judgment. Right now, there is no final version of the story, only competing frameworks, only evidence interpreted in different directions, only a case that is still being assembled in the language of the courtroom. And until that process concludes, nothing is fixed, not the narrative, not the meaning, not the final explanation. Everything remains in motion, waiting. Investigations gather information. Trials test it. Investigations build possibilities. Trials determine which of those possibilities can be legally supported beyond doubt. That distinction is critical, because everything that has been discussed so far, every detail, every shift, every emerging interpretation, exists in the investigative space. The trial is where those interpretations will be challenged directly, where certainty must be proven, not suggested, where narratives must survive confrontation, and where ambiguity is no longer enough. But even as the legal process moves forward, there is a question that does not sit inside courtroom procedure. It sits outside it. It lingers in the background of everything that led here. A question that does not depend on verdicts or outcomes. If the preserved blood sample had never existed, would anything about this case have ever been reconsidered? Would the original explanation have remained intact? Would the story have ended quietly, permanently, and without interruption? Or would it have simply been accepted as a closed medical outcome? Never questioned again? That question matters because it exposes something uncomfortable about complex cases. How much of what gets investigated depends on what survives. In this case, a routine medical protocol preserved something that was never intended to carry investigative weight. A small sample, a technical detail, a piece of biology that outlived the circumstances that created it. And that single detail became the difference between acceptance and re-examination, closure and reopening. Assumption and investigation, not because it solved anything on its own, but it allowed new questions to be asked. What makes this case linger is not just what was discovered. It is how close it came to never being questioned at all. Because without that preserved evidence, the most likely outcome would have been simplicity, a medical explanation, a known history, a conclusion that fits what was already understood. No deeper inquiry, no reinterpretation of the past, no expansion of the narrative, just closure, finality without interruption. And that is where the discomfort lives. Because now, two versions of the same life exist side by side. One shaped by the understanding available at the time. Another was shaped by what was later found. Neither erases the other, but only one will ultimately be formalized in court. And until that happens, both remain suspended. When proceedings begin, they will not just examine events. They will examine interpretation. They will ask, what evidence meets legal standards? What explanations are supported beyond a reasonable doubt? What timeline best fits the totality of facts? And in doing so, they will compress years of uncertainty into a structured decision, one that must, by law, resolve what has remained open. But even then, after all arguments are made, after all evidence is weighed, there is something that law cannot fully eliminate, the counterfactual, the what if, because long after verdicts are delivered, one question will remain outside the courtroom entirely, not legal, not procedural, but humans. If that blood sample had never existed, would anyone have ever looked again? Would anything have been questioned? Or would Stacy's story have ended the way so many complex medical stories quietly end, without further inquiry, without reconsideration, without the possibility that there was more to understand? And so, the case waits, not because it is forgotten, but because it is unfinished. The trial will come. Arguments will be made. A conclusion will eventually be reached in law. But even after that moment arrives, there will still be a space that no verdict can fully occupy. The space between what was accepted at the time and what was later made possible question. And in that space, the story of Stacey Robinson Huneker continues to echo, not as a conclusion, but as a question that never fully disappears. When the attention moves away from investigations, court filings, and forensic findings, something quieter remains. The people who have to live with what is left. For the family of Stacey Robinson Huneker, the case does not end where the timeline ends. It continues in daily life, in the absence, in responsibility, and in the long emotional aftermath of trying to understand something that never fully resolves. For Stacey's parents, grief is not a moment. It is a condition that evolves. At first, there is shock. Try to make sense of sudden loss that feels medically explained, yet emotionally unfinished. But over time, grief changes shape. It becomes an investigation. It becomes persistent. It becomes a need to keep asking questions long after other people expect silence. They are no longer only remembering their daughter. They are actively carrying her story forward, through legal processes, through uncertainty, through years of waiting for answers that have not yet fully settled. And that kind of grief is not passive. It is exhausting because it does not close. It continues alongside everything else in life. What makes this kind of loss especially heavy is not only the absence of closure, but the presence of ambiguity. There is a difference between knowing what happened and knowing that what happened is still being examined. That uncertainty creates emotional tension that does not fade easily. It reappears in conversations that revisit old memories, legal updates that reopen emotional wounds, quiet moments where unanswered questions return without warning. For families in cases like this, healing is not a straight line. It is interrupted repeatedly by reminders that the story is still unresolved in the only place that matters to them. And then there are the children. Stacey's daughters did not choose to become part of a case that would unfold in public attention, legal proceedings, and investigative review. They experienced it indirectly, but permanently. For children, loss is not processed the same way as it is for adults. They do not understand legal timelines. They do not follow investigative phases. They understand absence and disruption and the feeling that something important is missing from their world. Over time, that absence becomes part of their identity formation. It shapes how do they understand family? How do they understand safety? How do they understand continuity? Even when life moves forward, the absence does not disappear. It becomes something they grow around, not something they grow out of. In cases like this, children often live in two realities at once. The present reality of school, routines, and development, and the background reality of loss, legal uncertainty, and family absence. They are not separate worlds. They overlap, and that overlap creates a kind of emotional complexity that is difficult to fully see from the outside, because while adults manage the legal and procedural aspect of a case, children carry the emotional residue. Quietly, continuously, a family does not return to its original structure after a loss like this. It reorganizes, roles shift, responsibilities change, and what remains becomes something different than what existed before. For Stacy's family, this includes preserving her memory while navigating legal uncertainty, maintaining stability for the children, carrying emotional weight while still functioning in daily life, continuing forward even when closure has not arrived. It is not a single act of resilience. It is an ongoing adaptation. What the public rarely sees in cases like this is what happens after headlines fade. The phone calls continue. The legal steps take years. The emotional exhaustion does not follow a schedule. The private moments where grief resurfaces unexpectedly. There is no clean endpoint for families. No final moment where everything feels resolved. There is only continuation. Because this case is not only about investigation or legal proceedings. It is about the people who remain after those processes begin. It is about a mother whose life became a case file, and a family that refused to let that file become the final version of her story. It is about children growing up in the long aftermath of unanswered questions, and parents who continue to carry both memory and responsibility at the same time. Cases like this are often remembered for their details, timelines, evidence, courtroom developments, investigative turning points. But behind all of that, there is something quieter. People, lives that continue after the cameras move away. Families who do not get the option of stepping out of the story. They remain inside it, long after it stops being news, long after it becomes history. If stories like this matter to you, stories that go beyond headlines and into the human reality behind them, then this is exactly the place to stay, because every case we explore is not just about what happened, but about who is left behind to live with it. Subscribe for more deeply researched, emotionally grounded true crime documentaries. Turn on notifications so you never miss the next case. And join us as we continue uncovering the stories that deserve to be understood, not just reported, because the truth isn't only in the evidence. It's in our lives, forever changed by it.